Hey everyone, tonight we're going back, all the way back to a summer Saturday morning in a brand new post-war neighbourhood where the grass is very green and the neighbours are watching very closely. We have got a morning in a 1950s backyard that is technically yours, except in all the ways that apparently matters to everyone around you. We have got the story of William Levitt and the planned communities he built from scratch, because before there were suburbs, there had to be someone willing to bulldoze an entire way of life and replace it with something that photographed beautifully. We have got a day in the life of a lawn and garden supply salesman in 1956, a man who knocked on every door in America and learned things about his neighbours that no one ever admitted out loud. And we have got a look at what those unwritten backyard rules were actually enforcing, which turns out to be a considerably more complicated story than anyone's crabgrass would suggest. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up and let's go back together. It is a Saturday morning in the summer of 1953, and you are awake before you wanted to be. The light is coming in at that low, sideways angle that means it is before 7, which means the day has gotten there ahead of you again, which is almost impressive given how long the list is that you're already composing in your head before your feet have touched the floor. The bedroom is warm, the sheets have that faint particular smell of sleep and ivory soap, and the specific kind of closeness that comes from a house that has been buttoned up against last night's humidity. The window is open 2 inches. It was not enough. Your hair has registered its opinion on the matter, and you will deal with that later. Your husband is still asleep. The children are still asleep. The house is yours for approximately 12 more minutes, which is not nothing. You put your feet on the floor and feel the particular coolness of the wood before the sun has had a chance to warm it through the windows, and you walk to the kitchen in your housecoat with the quiet, specific efficiency of a woman who has learned that the only peaceful moments in a house this size are the ones you claim before anyone else wakes up to need something from you. The kitchen in the morning is a different room than the kitchen at noon. It is still yours in the morning. The percolator is on the counter. You fill it and set it going and listen to it begin its slow, promising negotiation with the grounds. And for a moment you stand at the window over the sink and look out at the backyard. There it is, 40 feet by 60 feet of your particular piece of the American post-war dream, and it is already asking something of you. The grass needs mowing. Not desperately, not in a way anyone would point at yet, but enough that you know. You know because you were out there 2 days ago, and the clover has come in along the south edge near the fence, and your neighbour Dorothy has been out in her garden every morning this week at 8 o'clock, which is not a coincidence, which is a message being delivered without a single word spoken. Dorothy's lawn does not have clover. Dorothy's lawn is the colour and consistency of a putting green. Dorothy's lawn suggests that Dorothy is a person who takes these things seriously, and it would be convenient if the rest of the street managed to reflect that. You are going to mow the lawn today. This was never not going to happen. The percolator finishes and you pour your first cup and drink it standing up, looking out at the yard, doing what amounts to a kind of morning assessment that no one ever told you to do, but that you have been doing for 3 years since you moved here. The rose of Sharon along the back fence looks good. You have been watering it on alternate days and keeping the suckers trimmed back, and it is rewarding that consistency in a way that nothing else in your life particularly is right now. The vegetable garden is coming along, tomatoes climbing their stakes. The beans are ahead of schedule. You have 3 zucchini that appeared almost overnight, the way zucchini does, with a kind of enthusiasm that feels personally aggressive. The clothesline is empty. It will not be empty for long. You finish your coffee and go back to the bedroom and get dressed quietly, while your husband sleeps, and you pull on your house dress and your apron because the apron is not optional. The apron is the uniform of the next 8 hours, and you go back to the kitchen and begin. The laundry was already sorted last night. You are not the kind of person who does not sort the laundry the night before. That is the kind of thing that separates a Saturday morning from a Saturday morning crisis, and you have learned this through experience. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. The washing machine is in the basement. You carry the first load down the stairs and get it started, and by the time you've come back up and started the oatmeal, and the children have thundered down the stairs with the particular energy of people who have not yet been asked to do anything, The morning has officially begun, which means the yard is now everybody's business. Your son Tommy is 8. He wants to go next door to play with the Kowalski boy. You tell him not until after breakfast, and not in the yard without shoes, and to keep his voice down because Mrs. Ashworth is probably still sleeping, and the sound carries over the fence in a way that you have been made aware of, politely, once, which was enough. Your daughter Linda is 11 and old enough to understand the geography of acceptable behaviour on a Saturday morning, which means she has gone to her room to read, which is the correct decision. You bring the oatmeal to the table and call everyone, and the kitchen fills up and you pour the orange juice and the toast goes in, and the morning proceeds the way mornings proceed on a street like this one, with a particular calibrated efficiency that looks from the outside perfectly natural and feels from the inside like a performance you have been rehearsing so long you have forgotten what the alternative would have been. After breakfast, the real work begins. You pull the first load of laundry up from the basement in the wicker basket, which is heavy in the specific way that wet sheets are heavy, which is a different kind of heavy than you were prepared for the first time you did it, and a kind of heavy you have long since stopped noticing. The clothesline runs from the corner of the house to the post your husband put in the first summer you were here, and it runs east to west, which means the morning light hits it directly, which means you have a narrow window in summer before the light gets too direct and starts to yellow the whites. This is not something anyone told you. This is something you learned. The protocol of the clothesline is more complex than it looks. Sheets go out first, largest items at the far end to catch the most breeze. Whites and colours are not hung together. Undergarments do not go on the outside line, the one that faces the street or that is visible from the Hendersons' kitchen window. There is an inside line for those, the one that runs parallel to the fence and is screened by the rose of Sharon, and that is where the intimate things go, quietly, because that is what you do, not because anyone specifically told you, because you understood, from the general atmosphere of the neighbourhood, that there is a visible world and an interior world, and the visible world is the one that counts. You hang the sheets with wooden clothespins and they go up damp and heavy and begin to move in the early morning air, and the smell of them as the sun hits them is one of the specific pleasures of this life that you do not have a name for. Clean laundry and morning sun. It smells like the week being managed. It smells like everything going according to plan. You go back inside for the second load. By 10 in the morning, the clothesline is full and the basement is empty, and you have swept the kitchen and put the breakfast dishes in the dish rack, and the children have been sent outside, which means the yard is now occupied, which means the yard is now a social situation. Tommy has found the garden hose. You have told him twice about the garden hose. The rule about the garden hose is not arbitrary. The rule about the garden hose is that the Millers are putting in a patio, and their yard is already difficult right now, and the last thing anyone needs is run off from your side going under their fence, which happened once and was handled with a note, and you have not forgotten the note. The note was friendly, that was worse. You bring the kitchen rug outside and hang it over the porch railing and beat it with the broom handle the way you do every other Saturday, and the dust comes out of it in small, satisfying clouds, and this is one of those tasks that is so physical and so immediate and so honest about what it is accomplishing that you almost enjoy it. Almost. Your arms are doing the work and your mind is doing something else, which is running through the afternoon. The lawn needs mowing, the tomatoes need tying up again, the border along the front walk has some weeds coming in, and you have promised to bring something to the Pattersons tonight because they just had the baby, and a casserole is the correct response to a baby, and you need to start that by 3. The casserole is not in question. The casserole is a neighbourhood obligation, which is different from a personal choice, which is not to say you do not want to help, but it is to say that the casserole would happen whether you wanted to or not. Because there is a system on this street, and the system runs on casseroles, and the occasional plate of cookies, and the understanding that you are all watching each other, all the time, with the particular attentive awareness of people who live 40 feet apart and share a fence line. You put the rug back down and go inside to start the casserole. By 11, your husband has the lawnmower out. This is his domain, and you are content to let it be his domain, because the machinery of the yard, the mowing and the edging, and the application of whatever the man at the hardware store has recommended this season for whatever the lawn is doing wrong this season, is something he attends to with a seriousness that you respect even when the timing is not ideal. He mows in rows. He mows the same direction every week. The neighbours on the right mow diagonally, which your husband has opinions about, which have never been expressed directly to the neighbours on the right, but which have been expressed to you, sitting at the kitchen table on 3 separate occasions, with a specificity that suggests he has thought about it considerably more than seems strictly necessary. You watch from the kitchen window. The rows are straight. The grass comes up even and clean behind the mower, and the smell of it comes through the screen. And it is the smell of summer, the smell of the 1950s on a Saturday, the smell that will still exist in some corner of your memory when all the other details have long since faded. He does the front first, then comes around back. You watch him navigate around the vegetable garden and the rosebush corner and the spot near the fence where the ground is slightly uneven, and always has been, and you think, not for the first time, that this particular piece of land is yours in a way that is different from the house itself. The house you live in, the yard you tend, the difference matters to you, even if you would struggle to explain it. Lunches, sandwiches. You make them and bring them outside on a tray because the yard is where the family is, on a Saturday in summer, on a street like this one, and the eating outside is not optional, it is part of what a Saturday in the yard is supposed to be. The children eat at the picnic table your husband built last fall from a kit and painted white, which was the correct colour for a picnic table on this street. You knew this without being told, the same way you knew a great many things on this street without being told. The afternoon gets warm, the humidity comes back, the casserole is in the oven and the house smells like it, which is a good smell, a reassuring smell, a smell that says this household is functioning the way a household is supposed to function on a Saturday. You go back out and finish tying up the tomatoes and pull the weeds along the border, which requires kneeling, which means your knees on the hard-packed earth between the plants, which means you will feel it tomorrow, which is not something you think about because the thinking about it does not help the doing of it. The rose of Sharon has another bud coming in on the south branch. You notice it the way you notice everything in this yard, with the specific intimate knowledge of someone who has been paying close attention for 3 years now, learning what the yard needs and when, learning its rhythms and its preferences the way you learn any living thing you are responsible for. You take the laundry in around 3. The sheets are dry and smell like sun and air and the particular cleanness of outside, and you fold them at the clothesline the way you do, creasing them along the existing lines, so the ironing goes faster later, and you carry them in and set them at the foot of the stairs to go up later. The casserole comes out of the oven at 4:30 and you let it cool on the counter and change your dress because you are taking it over and you do not take food to a new mother in an apron. This too is one of the unspoken rules. There are so many unspoken rules. You have learned them all without a lesson, without a book, without anyone ever sitting you down and explaining the system. You simply absorbed them, the way you absorb the smell of cut grass and the particular specific weight of a Saturday in summer, and by now they are so much a part of how you move through this world that you would not know how to remove them even if someone suggested you try. You cover the casserole with foil and carry it 3 houses down at 4:45 and ring the bell, and when the door opens you hand it over with the right words, the warm, specific, not overly familiar words of a neighbour who's been here 3 years and knows the system, and you walk back home in the early evening light and the street is quiet and the lawns are trimmed and the clotheslines are empty, and the barbecues are just starting to smoke 2 doors down. And for a moment, standing on your own front walk, looking back at your own piece of everything, you feel something that is not quite pride and not quite peace, but is something in between. The yard is in order, the week is behind you, dinner is an hour away. It is a good Saturday, that is enough. There is a thing that happens in a house like yours, in a neighbourhood like this one, around 10 minutes after your husband finishes mowing, which is that the smell of the freshly cut grass comes through every open window and changes the character of the air inside, and you notice it even when you are 3 rooms away doing something entirely unrelated to the yard, even when you are in the bathroom with the window above the tub cracked 2 inches. Even then the smell finds you, and it is the smell of summer and Saturday, and the specific confirmation that one of the major items on the list has been handled, and the combination of those things is a kind of relief that does not have a better name than what it is. The relief of a thing properly done. The lawn has rules about mowing that no one ever wrote down but that everyone on this street knows. You do not mow on Sunday morning before 10. This is not ordinance. It is agreement. The kind of agreement that exists because everyone in a new neighbourhood simultaneously discovers the consequences of breaking it, and the consequences are the kind that register immediately in the reactions of your neighbours when you see them afterward, and you do not make that mistake twice. You do not mow on a Saturday evening after 6 because the weekend evenings are for sitting out, and the sound of a mower at 7 on a Saturday evening is a kind of rudeness not dramatic, not something anyone would confront you about, but the sort of thing that goes into the account that neighbours keep of each other, that invisible running ledger of consideration and inconsideration that makes up the daily social life of people sharing a fence line. You mow Saturday morning, ideally before noon. This is the understood timing. Your husband knows it, the neighbours know it. The man across the street, whose name is Gerald and who has opinions about everything, has been known to watch the street on Saturday mornings with the particular attentiveness of someone who is keeping track, and you are aware of this, and your husband is aware of this, and the awareness has produced a household that gets its lawn mowed before noon on Saturdays, which is the desired outcome from Gerald's perspective, though no one has ever said so directly. The relationship between your household and Gerald's household is one of the quiet, ongoing negotiations of this street. Gerald's wife, Barbara, is pleasant in the specific way that someone is pleasant when they are also competitive, which is to say she is warm to your face and gives the impression, without ever saying anything that could be repeated, that she is comparing your yard to hers and has made conclusions. Her roses are better than yours. This is simply true. You're not going to contest it. Her roses are the roses of someone who's been doing this for 20 years longer than you have been doing this, who has a system, and the patience to run the system, and the resources to maintain it, and competing directly would be pointless. You tend your corner of the yard and you acknowledge her roses when you see her, and you have decided, quietly and entirely privately, that your tomatoes are better than hers, which they are, which she's never once mentioned. The children on this street have their own rules about the yards, rules that the adults have not fully written for them, but that the children have worked out among themselves with the particular thoroughness that children bring to systems of fairness and territory. The front yard is not the play yard on most of the street, because the front yard is the face of the house, and the face of the house is not for running through. The backyard is where the actual life happens. The backyard is where you can dig if the parents have designated a digging area, which most of the parents have, in the far corner by the fence, because children apparently require a digging area the way they require air, and providing one prevents the digging from happening where you did not want it to happen. The shortcut through yards is a subject of perpetual low-level negotiation. Some households permit it, others do not. The boundaries are not marked, but they are known, by the children if not always by their parents, and the child who cuts through a yard that has not been designated as a shortcut yard will encounter a response from that yard's adult occupant that ranges from the mild reminder to the direct instruction to the note delivered to their parents, depending on the household and the history and how many times the conversation has already been had. You have had it once with Tommy about the Henderson yard, and once was sufficient. The hedge between your yard and the walkers next door is technically the walkers' hedge because it was planted on their side of the property line, but it performs a function for both yards and you maintain your side of it, trimming back the branches that come over the fence and keeping the base clear of debris. Not because anyone asked you to, but because this is the understood thing. The hedge is a shared amenity, even if it is technically theirs, and maintenance is how you acknowledge that understanding. You and Helen Walker have never specifically discussed this. You simply both do it, on roughly the same schedule, and the hedge benefits from the arrangement, and so do both yards, and so does the fence line between you, which is the most intimate geographical relationship two households can have, and which requires this kind of unspoken coordination to function without friction. The sprinkler situation on your street is more complicated than it should be. The city has asked, in a letter that came to all households this spring, that residents water their lawns before 8 in the morning or after 7 in the evening to reduce waste during peak hours, and most of the street has complied because the letter came from the city, and the city is a legitimate authority that people on this street take seriously, and also because the sprinkler running in the early morning is genuinely a more pleasant thing for everyone than the sprinkler running at noon when people are trying to sit outside. But there is always the exception, and the exception on your street is the household at the far end, who waters at 2 in the afternoon on a consistent basis, and this has become the thing that people discuss when they need something to discuss. The way neighbourhood conversations always need something available, some mild shared grievance that allows for community without requiring anyone to say anything truly difficult. The 2 o'clock watering is everyone's convenient mild grievance for this season. Last summer it was the unmowed strip along the driveway at the corner house. Before that it was the Christmas lights that stayed up until February. These things rotate and they matter in the way that small community frustrations always matter, which is that they matter considerably more than they technically warrant. because they are not actually about watering schedules or unmowed strips or Christmas lights in February. They are about the maintenance of a shared understanding, and the person who breaks the small rule is representing in the imagination of the neighbourhood the possibility that bigger rules could also break, which is an anxiety that communities in the process of establishing themselves are particularly susceptible to. You're not particularly interested in the 2 o'clock watering controversy. You've noted it, and you have formed a private opinion, and you've declined to bring it up. This is also a choice that the neighbourhood has registered, without comment, in the ongoing account it keeps. You are the household that does not involve itself in small controversies. This has been noticed. You're not sure whether it counts in your favour or against you. In the social arithmetic of the street, you've decided you do not mind not knowing. There is a category of Saturday morning task in the backyard life that does not appear in any magazine or etiquette guide, and that is never discussed at the kind of gatherings where such things might come up, which is the task of dealing with whatever the yard has produced that you did not want it to produce. The volunteer thistle in the vegetable garden border, the bindweed coming up through the base of the fence, the particular spreading something that appeared near the base of the Rose of Sharon in the first week of June, and that you identified, after some study, as a seedling of the same species from last year's seeds, which is not a weed technically, but is also not where you need it to be, and so requires removal with the same decisiveness you bring to actual weeds. The compost situation is something you have had to think about more than you expected to when you moved here, because the compost pile is at the back of the yard, which means it is visible from the walker's kitchen window and partially visible from the yard behind yours, whose occupants are a retired couple, whose name you cannot quite remember and who have never introduced themselves, which is itself a mild violation of the neighbourhood protocol that says you introduce yourself to anyone new within the first week, or at any rate the first month, but they have been there for the entire 3 years you have been here, and the introduction has never happened, and at this point, it is too late to do it in the normal way, so you are in the situation of sharing a fence with people you do not know, which is its own kind of neighbourhood condition. Not hostile, not warm, just an absence where a relationship should be. The compost pile is kept tidy. You know it is visible. A tidy compost pile is not objectionable. A messy compost pile is not something you want to be having a conversation about, so the compost pile is tidy. Because these are the choices you make when you live in a place where the space outside your back door is part of the shared world of the street. The garden has its own rules about what belongs where, rules that you have developed through 3 years of trial, and the particular kind of error that happens when you plant something in the wrong spot and have to watch it fail in a way that takes the whole season. The beans want the east side, where they get morning sun and afternoon shade and the fence to climb. The tomatoes want the south side, maximum sun, staked carefully, because a tomato plant that is not staked is a plant that is telling you something about itself that you're going to regret discovering at full fruit. The zucchini want more space than you want to give them, and will take it anyway, which is the only aggressive thing about zucchini except for the sheer volume of what it eventually produces, which is a kind of aggression you learn to plan for. You have been sharing the zucchini for 2 seasons now, not as a gesture of magnanimity, but as a practical response to the arithmetic of a single zucchini plant in a productive year, which will produce more squash than a family of 4 can reasonably eat before the next one appears. You bring them to the neighbours in the way that surplus garden produce is always brought to neighbours on streets like this one, which is casually in passing, not as a formal occasion. Just here, this appeared. Do you want it? Yes, of course they want it. Everyone wants fresh zucchini in July before the glut sets in, and everyone is pretending their car was not in the driveway when you came to the door. The cucumber situation is different and always has been. You grow cucumbers. They produce reliably and consistently. You have never successfully given a cucumber to any neighbour, because everyone grows cucumbers, which is a thing you did not know before you started growing them, and have now observed as a consistent fact about backyard gardening in this neighbourhood. The cucumbers stay with you. This is fine. You like cucumbers. You have found 17 ways to use them in the course of 2 summers and are developing an 18th. The barbecue is your husband's territory, and you have no objection to this arrangement, because the barbecue is also the Saturday evening event, and the Saturday evening event is the one part of the week where the labour is visibly his rather than invisibly yours, where he is in the public domain of the backyard performing the hospitality role in a way that is seen and acknowledged, and you are, for approximately 90 minutes, not the person responsible for everything on the table. You made the potato salad, you made the beans, you made the dessert, but the thing on the grill is his, and the ritual of the thing on the grill, the adjusting of the coals and the timing of the placement, and the particular confidence with which he handles the tongs is not yours, and you are grateful for the not yours, even if the potato salad took 40 minutes. The first summer you had the barbecue, you invited the Walkers and the Hendersons, and it went well. Went better than you expected, because the yard was still new to all of you, and the newness made everyone a little more generous than they might eventually become, a little more willing to be pleased by the evening and each other, and the specific pleasure of sitting outside in the summer night, with food and people, and the sense that the neighbourhood was taking shape into something. The conversation was easy, the children played, the fireflies came up. It was the kind of evening that you file away as evidence for something, though not always sure what, and that comes back to you later when things are harder than usual, and you need the evidence. You have not had them all over at once since then. The dynamics have settled into something more specific and slightly more complex, and the large gathering requires a kind of social management that is more demanding than the warmth of the first summer suggests, and you have calibrated the social life of your yard accordingly. The Walkers for dinner in the early fall, the Hendersons for a Saturday afternoon in summer, the Pattersons when the situation calls for it, the Petersons not yet, because something about the timing has never quite worked, and you are not forcing it, because forcing it produces outcomes that feel forced. This is the ongoing work of being a neighbour on a street with history to it now, even short history, 3 years, enough for the relationships to have shapes that require tending along their particular lines. The barbecue smell is drifting from the Hendersons' yard by 5:30, and your husband has already noted it with the specific attention that men give to barbecue smoke when they are not the ones doing the barbecuing. You have noted it for different reasons. The smoke is going west, which means it is going toward the Petersons' backyard, and the Petersons have the baby, the new one, and you know from experience that Patricia Peterson has opinions about smoke that she has expressed before. This is the kind of calculation that happens constantly on a street like this one, invisible to anyone who is not doing it, which means invisible to most of the men and completely legible to every woman who lives here. You start dinner. The kitchen is warm from the afternoon and the oven and the general accumulated heat of a summer Saturday, and you open the window over the sink and the screen lets in the smell of the evening, cut grass and someone's roses and the distant charcoal sweetness from the Henderson end of the block. Your husband comes in and washes his hands at the kitchen sink, which you have asked him many times to please do in the bathroom, and he does it anyway because the kitchen sink is right there and the bathroom requires a separate trip, and you wipe the sink after him and say nothing because this is year 4 of the marriage and you have identified the arguments worth having. The children come in when called. They come in carrying the specific dirt of an afternoon in a summer yard, and Tommy has a scraped knee from something involving the fence that you will hear about in more detail than you are going to want, and Linda has grass stains on her shorts that may or may not come out, and they sit at the table and the dinner begins, which is the conclusion of a Saturday, which is the meal that closes the week before Sunday opens it again. After dinner you go back outside. This is the part of the Saturday that is actually yours. The light is going long and golden and the neighbourhood is settling into its evening sounds, screen doors and laughter, and the radio coming from somewhere, and the Hendersons' dog asking a question that will go unanswered. You sit in the lawn chair beside the garden and look at what the day has done to your yard and what the yard has taken from the day, and it looks good. The grass is cut, the tomatoes are tied, the laundry is in, the casserole is delivered, the border is weeded. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. You've done everything the yard asked of you today, and it has given something back, which is this: the particular deep satisfaction of a thing properly maintained, a small piece of the world kept in its right condition, tended and attended to, and returned to itself. This is not a small thing. This is what keeps everything working. The fact that no one will say so does not make it less true. The fireflies are coming up from the grass along the fence, and your daughter Linda is out there catching them in her cupped hands and letting them go. And the evening air is finally cooling, and somewhere down the street someone has a sprinkler going, and you can hear it turning in that slow rhythmic arc, and you think that this is, whatever else it is, a very specific kind of life, and you have made it work, and it is yours. The rules you followed today, the clothesline protocol and the casserole, and the careful management of the garden hose, and the particular way you trimmed the border, and the choice of the right words at the right door, none of them were written down anywhere. None of them came from a manual. They came from the street, from the air of the place, from 3 years of paying attention to what was expected and adjusting accordingly, and by now you could not separate them from yourself if you tried. They are simply how this yard works. They are simply what it means to live here. The fireflies keep going, and the evening keeps coming, and the yard holds everything it has held all day, your effort and your care and your specific considerable knowledge of what this piece of ground needs and when. And tomorrow is Sunday, which has its own rules, and the week will start again on Monday, and the yard will be there, waiting. The way it is always waiting, the way everything on a street like this one is always quietly waiting to see what you do next. And yet, what you have done today, in its entirety, is considerably more than anyone watching from outside could have measured. The people who wrote about suburban life in 1953 wrote about the lawns and the houses and the gleaming kitchens and the smiling wives and the children playing in the safe, green, well-ordered space of the post-war American yard. They photographed the casseroles and the clotheslines and the picnic tables. They did not photograph the woman standing at the clothesline at 7 in the morning, calculating the angle of the light. They did not photograph the note. They did not photograph the specific social weight that sits in the gap between a lawn with clover and a lawn without it, or the careful calibration of a conversation at a front door, or the hours of work that produced the thing that ended up looking effortless in the photograph. What you did today is what kept the whole picture in its frame, and the picture was beautiful. That is true. The grass was green and the laundry was white and the casserole was warm and the street looked, in the early evening light, like exactly what it was supposed to look like. But the picture did not keep itself. You kept it. You kept it with your hands and your feet and your back and your accumulated knowledge of 40 specific feet of ground. And the cost of that was the kind of thing that did not show up in photographs, and may not show up in history, but was real, was yours, was the work of a Saturday in 1953 that you have now carried through to its end. You go inside when the fireflies get thick enough that Linda starts asking to stay out longer, and you know that if she stays out longer, Tommy will too, and then there will be the whole production of baths and bedtime, and you have just enough left in you for the production if you start it now. You call them both in. They come, eventually, in the particular way that children come when they do not want to, which is technically compliance and is not what you asked for, but you take it. The house smells like dinner and the casserole and the warm air of the day, and you run the baths and do the bedtime and turn out the lights and close the doors and come back to the kitchen to put the last of the dishes away, and by the time you sit down it is 9 o'clock, and the house is quiet and your husband is in the living room with the television on low, and the yard is out there in the dark, resting, the way it rests, until tomorrow. You pour yourself a small glass of iced tea and sit at the kitchen table and let the quiet come in. The yard is out there, you know every inch of it. You know the soft spot near the back corner where the drainage has always been slightly wrong. You know the rose bush that wants more water than everything else, and the bean plant that wants less. You know where the clover comes in first and why, and what you're going to do about it. You know the specific sound the clothesline makes when it needs oiling, and you know it has needed oiling for 2 weeks, and you know that you are going to do it on Tuesday morning before the next round of laundry. This is the knowledge of a person who is paying attention. This is the knowledge of a person who has learned something real about something real, day by day, season by season, in a piece of ground that is small enough to understand and large enough to matter. Whatever else this life is, whatever it costs and whatever it does not give back, there is this. You know your yard. You know it the way you know your own hands. That is not nothing. That is a great deal. Take a moment with that yard, because what comes next belongs to the same world, even though it looks, from the outside, like something else entirely. To understand why every backyard on your street in 1953 felt the way it felt, why the rules had the weight they had, why the clover and the clothesline and the casserole existed inside a system this precise, you have to understand how the street itself came to be, and that means you have to understand William Levitt. He was, depending on who you asked and when, either the man who solved the American housing crisis or the man who turned a country's idea of home into a product line. He was a builder, an entrepreneur, a salesman of a very particular and persuasive kind, and he understood something in the years immediately following the Second World War that very few people had understood with the same clarity or the same ambition, that millions of Americans wanted a house of their own, desperately and immediately, and that the fastest way to give it to them was to build it the same way Ford had built cars. One piece at a time, in order, as fast as possible, over and over again until the demand was met. William Jared Levitt was born in Brooklyn in 1907, the son of Abraham Levitt, who had already established a modest building company in the years before the Depression. The family firm, Levitt & Sons, had built respectable houses in Long Island before the war, quality construction, custom work, the kind of thing that took time and reflected a certain understanding of what a house was supposed to be. Then the war ended, and everything changed, and William Levitt looked at what was coming and made a decision that would permanently alter the American landscape. The veterans were coming home, 17 million of them, many of them married or about to be, many of them starting families that had been delayed by 4 years of war, and they needed somewhere to live. The cities were already crowded, the existing suburbs were insufficient, rents were going up and housing starts were catastrophically low, and the gap between what Americans needed and what was available was wide enough to see from a considerable distance. William Levitt could see it clearly. In 1947, he began construction on what would become Levittown, New York, on 1,000 acres of former potato farmland on Long Island. The project was staggering in its scope and its ambition. He had studied Henry Ford's assembly line methods during the war, when his construction company had been building housing for naval personnel, and he came back with a conviction that houses could be built the same way cars were built. Not by craftsmen moving through a whole project, but by specialized crews moving through a sequence of operations, each one doing a single task, then moving to the next house, then the next, in a continuous flowing line of production. Levitt divided the construction of a house into 27 steps. Each step was performed by a specialized crew: concrete pourers, framers, roofers, electricians, plumbers. Each crew had one job, and they did it identically, on house after house after house, in a rhythm that produced astonishing results. At the peak of construction in Levittown, Levitt & Sons was completing 30 houses a day, not 30 houses a week, 30 houses a day. The site had its own lumber mill, it had its own cement mixer. It purchased appliances in quantities so large it was able to negotiate directly with the manufacturers and cut costs that were then passed to the buyer. The houses went up like something mechanical, because they were essentially mechanical, a production process that happened to produce homes. The first Levittown houses were available in 1947 for $60 a month, with no down payment required for veterans, which was almost no money at all for a family that had been renting a cramped apartment in the city for years. The waiting lists were immediate and long. People drove out to see the construction and came back with lease agreements in their hands. The design was simple: a Cape Cod or a ranch, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen with built-in appliances, an attic that could be finished for a 3rd bedroom if the family grew. The lot was 60 by 100 feet, which gave you a front yard and a backyard, and the possibility, for the first time for many of these families, of actual outdoor space that was yours. William Levitt understood the symbolic power of that outdoor space. He was not just selling houses, he was selling a particular version of the American life, and the yard was as much a part of the product as the kitchen or the living room. His promotional materials showed the lawns, the gardens, the children playing in the safe, green, well-defined space outside the back door. The yard was proof that you had made it. The yard was the visible, measurable, photographable evidence that you were no longer renting a 3rd-floor apartment without a fire escape garden. You had ground. It was yours. But Levitt also knew that this investment, both his and his buyers, depended on the neighborhood maintaining itself, which is a gentler way of saying what he actually built into the leases and eventually the deeds from the very beginning, a set of rules about how the property was to be maintained. The grass was to be mowed at regular intervals. The houses were to be kept painted. Certain types of fencing were permitted, and others were not. Clotheslines had to be screened. Gardens had to be contained. And in the original Levittown leases, the properties could not be sold to or occupied by anyone who was not Caucasian. That last rule was not a footnote. It was a structural element of the entire project, as deliberate and as engineered as the 27 steps of construction, and we will return to it. But first, the rules that governed the yards, the visible, everyday, entirely ordinary rules about grass height and fence type and clothesline placement, because those rules were not separate from the social project Levitt was building. They were the social project. They were the mechanism by which a brand new neighbourhood without a history, without the accumulated customs and memories that give older places their character, was going to enforce itself into coherence. Levitt was not the first person to impose covenants on suburban development. The history of suburban deed restrictions goes back to the late 19th century, when Frederick Law Olmsted and other landscape designers built planned communities with elaborate rules about building setbacks and architectural styles. By the 1920s and 30s, restrictive covenants had become standard tools in the suburban developer's kit, used to maintain property values and, in the terminology of the time, to ensure the quality of the neighbourhood, which was a phrase that did several things at once, some of them architectural and some of them considerably more troubling. But what Levitt built was different in scale, and that scale changed the nature of what the rules did. In an older neighbourhood, the rules had emerged over time, through habit and observation, and the gradual accumulation of community norms. In Levitt Town, the rules were installed before anyone had moved in. They were handed to the residents along with their keys and their lease agreements, which meant that the first generation of Levittown neighbours had an instruction manual for how to behave before they had any actual neighbours to observe. The rules came first. The community was built around them. By 1951, Levittown had grown to more than 17,000 homes and was home to more than 80,000 people, making it the largest housing development in American history at the time. William Levitt was on the cover of Time magazine. He was being discussed as a civic genius, a man who had solved a national problem through private enterprise and applied intelligence. His second Levittown, built in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, beginning in 1951, was even larger. A third development in New Jersey followed. He gave speeches about what he was building, and they were revealing. He talked about community. He talked about the importance of stable neighbourhoods for child rearing and family life. He talked about the lawn as a symbol of American domesticity and the pride of ownership. He genuinely believed these things, or something close to them. He had also, not coincidentally, designed a product that sold most effectively when everyone who bought it maintained it at approximately the same standard, because the value of any given house in Levittown was not independent of the houses around it. The neighbours' lawns were your lawn. The neighbours' fences were your fences. The neighbourhood was the product, not just the individual house, which meant that keeping the neighbourhood looking like the photograph in the brochure was not optional. It was the whole point. This is what Levitt understood that some of his competitors did not, or understood less completely. That he was not just building houses, he was building a social environment, and the environment had to be maintained the same way the houses did, with regular attention and enforced standards and the quiet, constant pressure of mutual observation. The yard rules were not incidental. They were infrastructure. Levitt sold the last of his Levittown properties in the 1960s and early 70s and turned his attention to international development, building planned communities in France and in other countries. He spent his later years in financial difficulty, having sold his company and then found himself legally prohibited from competing with the new owners, and he died in 1994 at 86 in a New York hospital. His company had built more than 140,000 homes. Entire generations of Americans had grown up in neighbourhoods built on his model. The pattern he established, the planned suburban community with a specific aesthetic standard, enforced by deed restriction, became the template for American suburban development for the next half-century. What he left behind was more than houses. It was a way of living that carried inside it a set of assumptions about what neighbours owed each other, and what the yard meant and how a community kept itself in the condition that made it worth living in. Some of those assumptions were reasonable. Some were a great deal more complicated than they looked. The lawns were beautiful and the rules were real, and both of those things were true at the same time, which is the only honest way to describe what William Levitt actually built. The lawn culture that Levitt helped to create did not invent itself in a vacuum. It arrived already half-formed, shaped by decades of advertising and horticulture publishing, and the particular American conviction, dating to the mid-19th century, that a well-maintained lawn was a moral statement as much as an aesthetic one. The cultural argument for the lawn as a character indicator goes back further than most people realise. Andrew Jackson Downing, the 19th century landscape designer and writer who was perhaps the most influential voice in American domestic gardening before the Civil War, wrote about the lawn as an expression of the civilized mind, as evidence that the person who maintained it had the right relationship to beauty and to nature and to the idea of a home as something that announced itself decently to the world. Downing was writing for a prosperous middle class that could afford grounds rather than just a yard, but the ideas filtered down over the decades and arrived, considerably democratized, in the post-war suburb. The lawn seed companies and the fertilizer companies and the pesticide companies understood this cultural freight and marketed to it constantly and skillfully. The Scott's Company, which had been selling grass seed since the 1860s, was perfectly positioned to meet the post-war suburban boom. By the mid-1950s, Scott's had developed a complete lawn care system, a step-by-step program of feeding and seeding and weed control marketed under the name Scott's Lawn Program, which told the American homeowner exactly what to put on their lawn and when to put it, in a language that was equal parts scientific credibility and aspiration toward the green perfection that the advertisements promised. The advertisements showed lawns that did not exist in nature. They showed the product of conditions that required not just the right products, but the right soil and the right light and the right moisture and the right starting material and years of consistent attention, which is to say they showed the ideal lawn rather than the achievable lawn, because the ideal lawn sold more product. The gap between the advertised result and the achievable result was the engine of the lawn care industry, because it meant that the homeowner who was trying to close that gap had to keep buying and trying and buying again. Your husband is part of this system. He knows it and does not know it, in the way that people know and do not know the systems they live inside. He reads the directions on the fertilizer bag with genuine attention. He follows the seasonal schedule that the Scott's brochure recommends. He has a specific opinion about the merits of weed and feed versus separate applications, and this opinion is based on something he read in the home improvement section of the Saturday paper, and that he can reproduce in detail, which he has done on more than one occasion to Gerald across the street, who has a different opinion based on something different he read in a different publication, and who is equally prepared to reproduce it. The lawn discussion between men on this street is one of the primary modes of male sociality in the neighbourhood, and it is serious in the way that male sociality in 1953 is serious, which is that the topic itself is not quite the point, but the information exchange and the opinion comparison and the implicit mutual assessment that happens within it are entirely the point, and the lawn is a very convenient topic for all of this, because it is simultaneously substantial and non-threatening, because everyone has one, because it is visible and therefore discussable without requiring anyone to invite anyone inside. The rose situation is different from the lawn situation, because roses are categorically more demanding and more rewarding and more expressive of individual character than any lawn, and the women who grow roses on this street are doing something that their husbands are not doing, and that falls entirely outside the male domain of lawn maintenance. The rose garden is, on this street and on most streets like it, the woman's project in the same way that the lawn is the man's project, and the two projects operate in the same yard without interfering with each other, which is a kind of marital cooperation that is built into the geography of the post-war backyard. Your rosebush, the single established one in the corner by the back fence, produces a deep pink bloom that smells, in late June, like the word rose should smell if the word could smell like anything. You have tended it for 3 years with a combination of attention and luck, because you did not know very much about roses when you moved here and everything. You know now you learned by doing and by asking, once, a question of Barbara Walker, who knows everything about roses, who answered the question thoroughly and without any of the condescension that you had been slightly afraid of, because Barbara Walker is better at roses than you are, but she's not mean about it. The asking of that question was its own small social negotiation. You chose the right moment, a Tuesday morning in the yard, informal, no performance required, just two women talking over the fence about a rosebush. The right moment for asking a question on this street, as on all streets, requires reading the situation, which means reading the person, which means understanding something about how they like to be approached and what they are comfortable with, and you have learned these things about your neighbours the way you learned the yard, by paying close attention over time. The story of Levittown also includes a chapter about what happened in the kitchens while the men were building the yards, which is a chapter that receives considerably less attention in the standard account, but that is at least as interesting. The women who moved into Levittown in the late 1940s and early 1950s were not passive recipients of a community that was being built for them. They were its primary daily architects, in the sense that they were the ones who occupied the houses 24 hours a day, who established the rhythms and the customs and the informal protocols that would eventually become the neighbourhood's character. The developers built the houses, the women built the neighbourhood. The sociologist Betty Friedan, who would eventually publish The Feminine Mystique in 1963, spent time in Levittown and developments like it in the mid-1950s, interviewing the women who lived there, and what she found was significantly more complicated than either the magazine version or the emerging feminist critique would acknowledge. Some of the women she talked to were genuinely content. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. Had moved from crowded apartments where their children had nowhere to play and where the domestic labour was performed in small dark kitchens with inadequate equipment, and the new house with the yard and the modern kitchen and the quiet street was a genuine improvement in their daily lives that they were not inclined to romanticise away. Their pleasure in the new space was real. Others told a different story. Women who had worked during the war and in the immediate post-war years and had given up careers or jobs to move with their husbands to the new suburbs and who found, inside the bright new kitchen, with the built-in appliances, a kind of emptiness that they did not have adequate words for, that the magazines told them they should not be feeling, that the husbands often could not fully understand or credit, that the neighbourhood itself, with its emphasis on visible domestic performance, did not make easy to express. These women were not unhappy in any simple or dramatic sense. They were living lives that were comfortable and safe, and materially better than what their mothers had had. They were also, some of them, quietly losing something, a sense of themselves as capable of something beyond the domestic that the new suburban life did not have a place for. Friedan named this the problem that has no name, and when she named it, the response suggested that a great many women had been waiting for someone to name it. But the naming was still 7 years away in 1953, and in the meantime the women of Levittown and the hundreds of developments built on its model were navigating the new life the only way available to them, which was to inhabit it as fully and as skillfully as possible, and to find within it whatever satisfaction it could yield. That satisfaction was not trivial. The women who gardened seriously, who cooked with real skill and ambition, who ran the social life of the neighbourhood with the kind of organisational intelligence that would have succeeded in any other context, who raised the children who would eventually go to the universities that their fathers had gone to on the GI Bill, who managed the family finances and the family relationships and the family's relationship to the community with a sophistication that was rarely acknowledged and never adequately compensated. These women were doing something real and difficult and valuable. The mistake is not to acknowledge that it was real and difficult and valuable. The mistake is to suggest that it was sufficient for everyone in the same way at the same time. It was not. For some women it was genuinely fulfilling. For others, the same tasks that fulfilled their neighbours felt like walls. Both of those experiences were real, in the same neighbourhood, in the same decade, behind very similar back fences. The decision about what to plant in the yard was, in many of these households, one of the few genuinely autonomous creative decisions that a woman made in the course of a week. The inside of the house was organised according to the functional requirements of the family. The cooking was organised according to what the family would eat, and what the budget would allow and what the season provided. But the garden could be anything. The garden could be roses if you wanted roses, or vegetables if you wanted vegetables, or a formal design of annuals in the European style, or a wild cottage garden if you had the temperament for it and the space to accommodate it. The garden was yours in a way that very little else in the domestic landscape was fully yours, and the women who gardened seriously tended to garden with an investment and an attention that reflected this, that understood the garden as a space where something was being expressed that did not have another outlet. Your garden is yours in this way. You know this about yourself, even if you have not said it to anyone, because saying it would require a vocabulary that is not quite available yet, a language for the interior life of a woman in a house dress on a Saturday morning that the era has not yet developed. But the garden knows it. The garden responds to you the way things respond to genuine attention, which is that it thrives, and the thriving tells you something about the quality of what you have brought to it, and that knowledge is your own. The Levittown story does not end with Levitt, because no story about a community ends with its builder. What happened to Levittown after the houses went up and the families moved in and the rules took effect is in many ways more interesting than the construction itself, because what happened was exactly what Levitt had engineered for and also considerably more than he had bargained for. The first families who moved into Levittown, New York were overwhelmingly working class and lower middle class, young and almost entirely white, because the original leases prohibited rental or sale to anyone who was not Caucasian, a restriction that was common in suburban development of the period and was upheld by the Federal Housing Administration's own underwriting guidelines, which had been quietly steering mortgage insurance toward racially homogeneous neighborhoods since the 1930s. This was not an accident. It was policy, federal and private, interlocking and mutually reinforcing, and it meant that the access to home ownership that transformed the post-war generation's financial trajectory was not available to all Americans equally. Within those original constraints, the community that formed in Levittown was genuinely remarkable in certain ways. People who had grown up in the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Queens and the South Bronx found themselves, suddenly, with a piece of American green space that was absolutely their own. They planted gardens, they built additions, they finished their attics and converted their garages, and put in swimming pools and altered the identical facades of their Levitt houses until the street that had been designed as a series of interchangeable units began to take on the particular character of a place that people had invested in and cared about. The sociologist Herbert Gans moved into Levittown, New Jersey in 1958 and spent 2 years there, and the book he eventually wrote about the experience, published in 1967, was one of the first serious sociological portraits of the planned suburb. What Gans found was not the conformist wasteland of the popular critique. He found a genuinely social community of people who were engaged with their neighbours and their local institutions in ways that urban sociologists had assumed were impossible in a development built on mass production. People were joining clubs. They were organising politically. They were fighting about schools and traffic and what kind of businesses should be allowed in the commercial areas. They were doing, in other words, what people always do when they're given a community and enough investment in it to care what happens next. But Gans also documented the rules. The endless specific unwritten social rules that govern neighbourhood life in Levittown, rules about lawn maintenance and noise levels, and the timing of parties and what was said or not said across the fence, and what happened when someone's standards slipped below the community threshold. He wrote about the social pressure that existed in a neighbourhood where everyone was visible to everyone else, where the yards were open and the windows were close and the fences were either absent or low enough to look over, and where the implicit bargain of the community was that you would hold up your end. Some people found this pressure suffocating, others found it stabilising, most found it so much a part of the texture of life that they would have found it very difficult to explain what the pressure was, because by the time Gans arrived to ask questions, the rules had been absorbed into the normal, into what it simply meant to live on a street like this one, in a house like these houses, in a community that had been designed to function in a specific way, and had been largely doing so. The restrictions on racial occupancy in Levittown were challenged first informally and then legally, and the legal challenge that transformed not just Levittown but American housing law broadly came not from New York, but from Levittown, Pennsylvania. In 1957, a black family, William and Daisy Myers, purchased a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania from a white family who was leaving. Their arrival was met with a sustained campaign of harassment from some of their neighbours that lasted for weeks and made national news. A hostile crowd gathered outside their house for nights on end. Windows were broken. A Confederate flag was hung across the street. Local officials and state police eventually intervened to maintain order. The Myers family stayed. Their courage was not incidental to the transformation of American housing law that followed in subsequent years. It was the ground on which the argument was made. The Levittown that William Levitt had built as a racially restricted community did not remain one, and the slow, contested, often dangerous process of that change is part of what those lawns and those fences and those deed restrictions actually contain. The rules about grass height and clothesline placement were the visible surface of a system that went considerably deeper, and the depth of that system is part of the story of the American post-war suburb that the photographs in the brochures never quite managed to capture. William Levitt himself, when asked in later years about the racial restrictions in his original developments, gave answers that were unsatisfying and incomplete. He said he had been responding to market conditions. He said he had been required to follow FHA guidelines. He said the restrictions had been lifted. None of these answers were wrong exactly, but none of them were sufficient either, and the gap between his explanations and the full account of what his communities built into the American landscape is a gap that historians are still measuring. What is beyond dispute is this: the Levittown model, replicated in hundreds of developments across the country in the 1950s and 60s, created the physical and social infrastructure of modern American suburban life. The yard and its rules, the fence and its protocols, the lawn and its expectations, the casserole and its obligations, all of it exists inside a world that William Levitt and the many builders who followed his model brought into existence from what had been, not very long before, a potato field. That transformation was genuinely extraordinary. Its costs were real and various. Both of those things lived together in the same green lawn, under the same morning sun, waiting for the same woman to come out with the same laundry basket and take stock of what needs doing. The story of what Levitt built also includes a side of the business that he did not put on the cover of Time magazine, which is what happened to the Levittown houses over the ensuing decades, as the original buyers aged and the neighbourhood aged with them, and the rules that had been so rigorously enforced in the early years began to evolve, as rules always do, in the direction of the people living under them rather than the people who wrote them. The communities that Levitt built did not freeze in 1953. They kept going, kept changing, kept absorbing new families and new perspectives and new ways of understanding what the yard was for and what the neighbourhood owed to itself. The Cape Cod that had been built identically to its neighbours in 1947 looked different in 1967. Additions, renovations, painted in colours that Levitt had not anticipated, landscaped in styles that his original vision had not included. The original homogeneity had been the product of construction, not character, and character, it turned out, could not be held to a production schedule. The aluminum siding companies did a brisk business in Levittown from the mid-1950s onward, because the original clapboard siding required painting every few years, and painting was labour and expense, and the aluminum promised you would never have to do it again. The original buyers were enthusiastic. Some of their neighbours were not, because the aluminum looked different from the wood, and the different looked wrong, looked like someone was not holding up their end of the implicit bargain, which was that this neighbourhood would maintain a certain coherence, and coherence required a certain uniformity, and uniformity required that no one do anything dramatically different. This argument, which sounds from here like an argument about siding, was really an argument about belonging, about what it meant to own a piece of a planned community, about what the purchase of a Levitt house had included, and what it had not included, about whether you had bought a home in the sense of a place that was fully yours to do with as you chose, or whether you had bought a stake in a collective project that had its own requirements that preceded your preferences and would outlast them. People had this argument in Levittown for decades, in various forms, about various specifics, and the argument was never fully resolved, because it was not the kind of argument that resolves. It is, in fact, still being had, in slightly different language, in homeowners associations across America right now, every time someone wants to paint their front door a colour that is not on the approved list. William Levitt, in building Levittown, had solved the housing problem and simultaneously created a new kind of community question, one that had not existed before in quite this form, because the community had not existed before in quite this form. The question was, if you build a neighbourhood from scratch, with a set of rules installed at the beginning, does the community belong to the rules, or do the rules belong to the community? The answer that Levittown's residents worked out over decades was, characteristically American, that it was both and neither, and it depended on the specific rule and the specific moment and who exactly was doing the asking. The lawns are still there. The houses, most of them, are still standing, much modified, much added to, carrying 50 and 60 years of individual family decisions, layered over the original Levitt blueprint like the rings of a tree. You can still see the original bones if you know what to look for. The roof lines, the setbacks, the proportions of the lots, the particular way the streets curve that is the signature of a certain approach to suburban planning, designed to slow traffic and create a sense of enclosure, of neighbourhood rather than thoroughfare. Drive through Levittown, New York today and you will see all of this. And you will see something else too. The particular character that develops in a place that has been lived in hard, by real people with real needs and real preferences and no particular interest in remaining photogenic for the brochure. The individual has won in Levittown as it tends to win everywhere over time against the design. The yard that Levitt imagined, orderly and green and uniform, has been replaced by the yards that its residents needed, which are messier and more various and in every important sense more interesting. That is what happened to the product William Levitt built. It became a place. That transformation from product to place, from planned community to actual community, with all the friction and character that entails, is arguably the most important thing he built, though it was not what he intended to build at all. Which brings us to the man who knew those yards better than anyone, better in some ways than the people who lived in them, because he saw them all. Every yard, every street, every new development, from Long Island to the San Fernando Valley, in the years when America was building itself from scratch and needed, among many other things, something to put in the ground. His name might have been Gerald, or Robert, or Wallace, but let us call him Ray, because that is the kind of name men like him had in 1956, and because what matters here is not the particular man but the particular position. Lawn and garden, salesman for a regional supply company, covering the new suburban territories of the post-war Midwest. 32 stops on a good week. More when the season was right. A trunk full of samples, and a head full of knowledge that nobody had asked him to acquire, but that he had acquired anyway. Because that is what happens when you spend enough time in other people's yards. You are Ray, on a Tuesday morning in May of 1956, and you have been on the road since 7 and your first stop is already behind you. The hardware store on Route 18 that takes a standing order of grass seed every spring and is not interested in anything new, which is fine, which is not all your customers, and you are pulling into the parking area of a new development on the west side of town that went up last year and is now fully occupied, meaning the grass is in and the gardens are beginning, meaning these are your people. You get out of the car and take a moment to assess the street, which is something you do automatically now, the way a doctor looks at a patient before they have said a word. The lawns tell you everything. The dark green, dense ones belong to people who have been following the lawn care calendar, who have applied their pre-emergent herbicide in early April and their first feeding of the season in late April, and are now watching the results with the satisfaction of people who have done the right things in the right order. The thin, pale lawns belong to people who bought their house last fall and have not yet learned that what you do in the fall determines what you get in the spring, and these people need you, or someone like you, to explain the relationship between October and May before another season goes past. You put your hat on and take your sample case from the trunk and start at the near end of the block and work your way down, which is the system, which has always been the system. Knock and introduce and ask a question before you make a claim, because the question puts you in the yard and the yard is where the conversation happens, because people are different in their yards than they are at the door. The first door is answered by a woman in a house dress with flour on her hands, and you apologize immediately for the interruption, because you have learned, early and thoroughly, that arriving at the wrong moment in a housewife's morning is a recoverable error only if you acknowledge it immediately and with genuine humility. She does not invite you in, which is correct, which is expected. She listens to your introduction, which is brief, and her eyes go to your sample case, and she says she will get her husband, and you say of course, and you wait on the porch. Her husband comes out, and this is the standard choreography of a lawn call in 1956. The wife opens the door, the husband comes out, you talk to the husband in the yard while the wife goes back to the kitchen, and the products you're selling are in the husband's domain. Officially, because the yard is the husband's domain. Officially, because the inside is the wife's, and the outside is the husband's. And that is the division that this neighbourhood and every neighbourhood like it operates on, which is the official version of the story. The unofficial version, which you have learned through years of making these calls, is considerably more interesting. The husband comes out and you walk the yard together and you talk about the grass and the soil and what the lawn needs, and he is engaged, he is genuinely interested, and the conversation is real. But then his wife appears at the kitchen window, the one that looks out over the backyard, or she comes to the door to ask something, and the dynamic shifts, because she is the one who has been looking at this lawn every day. She is the one who noticed the thin patch by the fence 3 weeks ago and the clover coming in along the south edge last week. She is the one who has been watering and watching and making mental notes about what needs attention, and when she has something to say about it, which she sometimes does, she says it with a specificity that her husband cannot match. You have learned to talk to both of them. You have learned to answer the husband while making sure the wife can hear, and to phrase certain things in ways that give her an opening to add what she knows, which she often does, because what she knows is frequently the most relevant information in the conversation. The fertilizer schedule she has already been following, the specific problem with the corner where the water pools, the roses that are doing well and the ones that are not, and the question of whether the ones that are not can be saved or whether you need to advise pulling them out and starting over. This particular household, the one on the near end of the block, has a lawn that is in reasonable shape, but has a disease problem coming in on the east side, brown patch. You can see it from the walk, and you bring it up directly, because directness is your best tool, because people on these streets are not buying flattery, they are buying solutions, and the solution to brown patch is a specific fungicide applied in the evening when the dew is setting, and you have it in the trunk. And by the time the husband has agreed to try it, you have also sold him a bag of lawn fertilizer and a soil acidifier for the roses, which his wife has mentioned twice by this point, and which she will be the one applying because she is the one who tends the roses, which both of them know and neither of them says. You walk back to your car and make your notes and move to the next house. The second house has a magnificent vegetable garden running along the south fence. A serious garden, someone's project, rows of tomatoes and beans and what looks like a corner devoted to herbs, and you recognize immediately that whoever planted this knows what they are doing, which means they do not need your advice but they might need your products. You knock, and the woman who comes to the door is the one who planted the garden. You can see it in the way she looks past you to check on something before she looks at you, and you lead with the garden, which is the correct opening gambit. You tell her it looks serious, which it is, and she relaxes immediately, which is the thing that happens when someone with expertise is recognized as having expertise. You spend 12 minutes at that door and she buys a specific organic bone meal fertilizer that you have been having trouble moving because the cost is higher than the synthetic alternatives, and she buys it because she knows the difference and because you knew she would know the difference. And you make a note to come back in August because she is exactly the kind of customer who will be interested in the full garden preparation products. The products you carry tell a story of an industry that changed almost completely in the decade following the war. Before the war, the average American household garden was managed with whatever was at hand, compost and animal manure, and the occasional application of something purchased at the feed store, and the relationship between the gardener and the garden was fundamentally one of working with what was available. After the war, the chemical companies that had developed extraordinary capabilities in synthesis and application during the conflict turned those capabilities toward domestic markets, with results that transformed the American garden almost overnight. DDT was available as a household pesticide. Chlordane was available for grubworm control and was sold widely for lawn application through the 1950s. 2,4-D, a selective broadleaf herbicide that killed clover and dandelions while leaving grass unharmed, had been available since the mid-1940s, and by the early 1950s was in virtually every hardware store in America, marketed under brand names that made it sound as harmless and domestic as dishwashing liquid. You carry several of these products, you sell them routinely. The questions about their long-term effects have not yet been asked in any public way, because Rachel Carson's Silent Spring will not be published until 1962, and until that publication most Americans understand the new chemical products for the lawn and garden as straightforward improvements, modern solutions to old problems, progress. You sell what people ask for and what the industry produces. You're not in a position to know in 1956 what the science will eventually say about some of what is in your trunk, and so you sell it, as you are trained to, as it is marketed to you with confidence in the product and genuine belief in its usefulness, because it is useful, in the narrow sense. It does what it says it does. The dandelions do die, and the grubs do not return, and the lawn is greener and denser for the application. The fuller accounting will come later, and you will not be the one who has to make it. The organic gardening movement exists in 1956, but barely, and the people who practice it are, in the neighbourhoods you serve, a distinct minority. J.I. Rodal, who founded Organic Gardening and Farming magazine in 1942, has a devoted readership, but his readers in the new suburbs are the exception rather than the rule. And when you encounter one, which you do perhaps once a month, the conversation goes differently than the standard call. These customers do not want the chemical products. They want the compost, the bone meal, the blood meal, the particular niche products that the organic approach requires, and you carry them because the margins are good and the customers tend to be loyal and specific in their needs, which makes them easier to serve. The woman with the serious vegetable garden on the 3rd Street of the Eastern Development, the one who bought the bone meal, is going to be an organic customer for as long as she's gardening on this street. You can tell from the first conversation. She has the vocabulary, she has the knowledge, she has the particular philosophical conviction of someone who has thought about why she does things the way she does them, and has arrived at conclusions she is confident in. You respect this, even where it diverges from what you are selling, because the knowledge is real and the conviction is earned. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. What you've found over 11 years of making these calls is that the most interesting customers are almost always the ones who know the most, because the ones who know the most are also the ones who ask the best questions, and the best questions are the ones that make you a better salesman, that send you back to the company rep and the product literature, and sometimes to the university extension office for the information you did not have before you were asked. You have learned most of what you know about lawn and garden from customers who knew things you did not know when you arrived at their door. The company you work for has changed since you started. The product line has expanded enormously. When you began this route in 1945, just back from the Pacific, and looking for something that would keep you outside and moving, the catalogue had perhaps 40 items. Now it has over 200, and new products come in every spring and fall, and the learning is continuous, which is one of the things about this job that you would not trade for a desk, because a desk does not send you new problems to solve every week. You are not a wealthy man. The salesman's life is comfortable but not lavish, especially in the years when the spring season is slow, or the summer runs dry, and the watering restriction notices go out, and the lawn care spending gets deferred in favour of the grocery bill. You know these rhythms, you plan for them. You have a wife who is frankly better at the financial planning than you are, who has organised the household budget with the same systematic attention that you apply to a client's seasonal lawn care calendar, and the household runs accordingly. Your son is 12 and interested in baseball, not in lawn care, which is a source of mild amusement that you discuss with no one because the discussion would require acknowledging a disappointment that you are not going to allow yourself to feel because your son does not owe you an interest in your work. Your son owes you nothing but to be who he is, and who he is someone who can talk to you for 45 minutes about the 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers in a way that makes you feel, temporarily, the same thing you feel when you talk about lawn care to a customer who knows what they're talking about. The same engagement, the same genuine pleasure of shared knowledge. It is the same, you have decided. That is enough. You pull into your driveway at 6:30 on Tuesday evening, and your wife is in the kitchen, and the smell of dinner is in the house, and the radio is on low, and you sit in the car for the transition moment, looking at your own lawn, which needs the attention you have been giving to everyone else's lawn all day, and you think, as you often do at this moment, that you will get to it on Saturday. And you know, as you always do at this moment, that you probably will, because Saturday is when you always get to it, and the lawn is patient, the lawn waits, and on Saturday morning you will be out there with the mower before 9, ahead of Gerald across the street for once, ahead of the schedule, doing the thing that you understand completely because it is your thing and your lawn and your Saturday, and that will be a good morning. The lawn care industry's relationship with science in the 1950s was a complicated one, because the science was moving fast and the marketing was moving faster, and the gap between what was actually known and what was being confidently claimed in the advertising sometimes opened up into territory that would look different in hindsight than it looked at the time. You are in the middle of this as a salesman. You know what the company tells you, you know what the product labels say, you know what the extension service literature says when you bother to read it, and you read it more often than most of your colleagues because you have decided that knowing the actual agronomy makes you a better salesman, which it does, and also because you are genuinely curious about it, which is probably the more honest reason. The nitrogen-phosphorus-potassium formulation that appears on every bag of lawn fertilizer in your trunk reflects a real understanding of what grass needs. Nitrogen for the leaf and stem growth that gives you the dense green colour that the advertisements promise. Phosphorus for the root development that gives you the lawn that comes back strong after winter and holds up under the stress of summer. Potassium for the overall health and disease resistance that means the lawn is not just green but resilient. These are real, documented relationships between chemistry and plant biology, and applying them correctly produces real improvements in the lawn, and the improvements are measurable and visible and constitute a genuine form of knowledge that was developed over decades of horticultural science. But the science also had edges that the marketing did not follow the science to. The question of what happens to the nitrogen that runs off the lawn after application and goes into the stormwater and eventually into the nearest body of water was not being asked in any systematic way in 1956, because the scale of suburban development had not yet produced the kind of water quality problems that would eventually force the question. The question of what happens to the birds and the beneficial insects and the earthworms when you apply the pesticide that kills the grubs was being studied in some university laboratories, but was not part of the public conversation because Rachel Carson had not yet made it part of the public conversation. You are a salesman, not a scientist, and you're operating within the information landscape of 1956, and in that landscape the products you sell are presented, and generally understood, as straightforward improvements. You have no particular reason to doubt this, and you have practical reasons to accept it, and so you do. What you carry in the trunk is what the era provides, and you carry it in good faith, and the lawns that receive it are, by the measures available in 1956, better for having received it. The deeper knowledge will come, it is already coming, in the university labs and in the occasional sharp question from a customer who is paying attention to something that the marketing is not mentioning. You have had 3 customers in the last 2 years who have asked you about the effect of the lawn pesticides on the earthworm population, and you have answered as honestly as you could, which is to say you have said that you believe the targeted application at the recommended rate should minimize impact on non-target species, which is what the product literature says and which reflects your genuine understanding. Whether that understanding is complete is a question you cannot fully answer in 1956. The customers who ask these questions are doing something that is, in retrospect, ahead of its time. They are bringing a systems perspective to a practice that is being sold as a series of individual interventions, and they are right to do it. Even if the full answers are not yet available, you respect them for asking. You do not have everything they are looking for, but you remember their addresses, and when new information becomes available from the company or from the extension service, you bring it back. This is the part of the job that is not strictly about selling products. It is about being a reliable source of information for people who need reliable information, and this is what keeps people calling you back when the season turns. The physical knowledge of 11 years on the road is a kind of knowledge that has no equivalent in a textbook. You know how to read a lawn the way you know how to read weather, from accumulated observation and the willingness to pay attention to what you see over time. You know what a lawn looks like 3 days before it is going to start showing stress from dryness, before it actually goes brown. You know what the particular colour shift in the blue-green of a turf grass means in terms of nitrogen status. You know the difference between the yellowing that indicates iron deficiency and the yellowing that indicates overwatering, and the yellowing that indicates disease. And you know them not because you looked them up this morning, but because you have seen all 3 of them enough times to have the pattern in your eye permanently. This is practical knowledge of the kind that is built entirely through practice, and it is the reason that a salesman who has been on the same routes for 11 years is worth something to his customers that a new salesman cannot replicate. Because the new salesman has the product knowledge, and the product knowledge is real, but the landscape knowledge, the knowledge of what this specific region's soil does in a dry year and what it does in a wet one, and which diseases run through certain parts of town in certain conditions and which lawns are going to have trouble before their owners know it. That knowledge is not in any catalogue. It lives in the salesman's head, built from 11 years of Tuesday mornings and Saturday afternoons, and the accumulated conversation of a few hundred people with a few hundred different pieces of ground. It is, you have sometimes thought, the most intimate knowledge of a place that you could have without actually living in it. You know these streets better than most people who live on them know each other. You know them yard by yard, season by season, in all their difficulty and all their particular beauty, and the people in them have trusted you with that knowledge in the way that people trust anyone they have been letting into their yards for years, not by decision but by accumulation, one Tuesday at a time. By noon you have done 8 houses and you are back in the car eating your sandwich, which your wife made this morning, which you're eating in the driver's seat with the window down, and you're thinking about what you have seen and heard and what it adds up to, which is the particular kind of thinking that comes from a job that puts you inside other people's lives for 12 minutes at a time, over and over again, across years and seasons and the slow evolution of a neighbourhood's relationship with its own ground. What you have seen by May of 1956 is the full range of what American suburban yards can be, from the obsessive and immaculate to the cheerfully chaotic to the quietly suffering. And the thing that connects all of them is not the grass or the gardens or the products, it is the weight that people put on the yard as a measure of something. It is not always clear to the people themselves what the yard is measuring. But it is measuring something. You have seen men spend more time on their lawns than they spend with their children, working the ground with a devotion that their own fathers would have found bewildering, because their fathers' lawns had been patches of dirt or hard-packed earth around a rented house. And the idea of a lawn that required this kind of attention was not part of the world their fathers had inhabited. You understand the appeal. You have your own lawn. You do not do half of what some of these men do to theirs, but you understand the appeal, which is that the lawn is a thing you can control. In a world that presents relatively few such things, the job is what it is. The marriage is what it is. The children are who they are, but the lawn responds to what you put into it. If you do the right things in the right order, at the right times, the lawn improves. It is one of the few domains of post-war male suburban life that offers a direct and legible relationship between effort and result. And that is not nothing. That is actually a considerable thing, and the companies that make lawn care products understand this and have been selling it back to the men since before the war. You finish your sandwich and make your notes from the morning calls and plan the afternoon. You have 4 more stops on this street, then 3 on the development 2 miles east, then the garden centre on the highway that takes a monthly standing order. You pull out of the parking area and turn right and drive slowly down the street, looking at the lawns, which is both professional habit and genuine curiosity, because every lawn is a portrait of a household, if you know how to read them. The lawn that needs mowing by 3 days tells you the husband worked late all week. The lawn with the new border of marigolds along the front walk tells you the wife has been to the nursery recently and is starting a project. The lawn with the dead pine tree in the corner that has not been removed tells you something about the household's current capacity for dealing with things that require decision and effort, or tells you something about a disagreement that has not yet been resolved about whose job the pine tree is, which amounts to the same thing. The lawn with the vegetable garden taking over 50% of the available space tells you about ambition, and possibly about a household where the woman is doing something that pleases her, and the husband is allowing it because the alternative is not allowing it, and the garden does not cost much and keeps things peaceful. Every lawn is a story. After 11 years of doing this, you read them the way other people read books. The 3rd house on your afternoon list is a different kind of call. The man who answers is in his early 60s, older than the typical resident of this development, and his lawn has the particular quality of a lawn that was excellent 2 years ago and has been slightly neglected since. Not badly, not embarrassingly, but enough that you can see what it was, and what it is, and what the gap between them means. He is recently retired, you learn in the first 90 seconds, and his wife has recently been dealing with something he does not specify, a health thing, and the yard, which he used to take considerable pride in, has slipped down the priority list without, you can tell, him fully acknowledging that it has slipped or understanding why he does not feel the same pull toward it as he once did. You spend more time on this call than the average, not because you are going to sell him more product, though you will sell him some, but because the conversation is the kind that you do not walk away from prematurely, because the man is telling you something, not about the lawn but about the year he has had, and the lawn is just the surface of it, the acceptable outdoor male version of what is going on, and you listen, and you ask a question or two, and you do not pretend the lawn is what you are both actually talking about, though you also do not say directly what you are both actually talking about, because that is not how it works. Not in 1956, not with a man you have met 8 minutes ago, not on a Tuesday afternoon in a new suburban development in the post-war Midwest. You sell him a basic starter fertilizer and a bag of overseeder, and you tell him May is actually the perfect time to address the thin spots if he can manage it, and he says he will try, and you believe him, and you say you will stop back in the fall, and he says he looks forward to it, and you mean that too. You have customers like this on every route. You have been coming back to them for years. Some of them have become the thing that is almost but not quite a friendship, which is the relationship that develops between a salesman and a customer when the transaction is honest and the visits are regular, and the years accumulate, and the lawn is the thing they talk about because the lawn is always there, and it always needs something, and it is a reliable, comfortable, entirely manageable subject for two people who are not quite friends, but are not quite strangers either. You get back in the car at 4 o'clock and the afternoon is going to bronze and the new subdivision to the east is still waiting, and you have a schedule to keep. But you take a moment before starting the engine to look at the street you have just worked. 8 houses with their yards facing the afternoon light. 8 different answers to the same basic question of what to do with a piece of ground that is yours. All of them, in their various ways, doing their best, which is what people mostly do when they have invested in something, which is what a yard asks you to do the moment you start caring about it. You start the engine and pull out and head east, and the street falls away behind you, but the lawns stay with you the way they always do, because you have learned something from all of them, and what you have learned goes beyond grass seed and fungicide and the correct pH for a healthy lawn. What you have learned, over 11 years on these routes, is that the yard is never just the yard. It is the household explaining itself to the neighbourhood, and the neighbourhood talking back. It is a conversation that never exactly stops, conducted in grass and garden, and the very particular language of maintenance, which every yard on every street is either speaking or failing to speak, continuously for as long as anyone is home. The eastern development is newer, still in the process of becoming itself, some of the front walks not yet poured, a few houses still waiting for their sod, and you have been here before, twice. Once when it was only the sales office, and you introduced yourself to the developer's representative to see about getting your products included in the welcome package, which is a pitch you make to every new development, with mixed results, and once in September, when the first families had moved in and were standing in their yards looking at the mud with the expressions of people who have just realised that what they bought is a piece of ground, and a piece of ground is not the same as a lawn. Those calls are satisfying in a particular way. You are the person who shows up with the answer to the question they have just understood they need to ask. What do you put down first? What do you do about the clay? When do you seed and when do you sod, and what's the difference, and does the difference matter? And yes, the difference matters, and here is why, and here is what you will need, and here is the order in which you will need it. You hand them a schedule, which you print yourself on the mimeograph in your garage, a seasonal lawn care calendar for the Midwest that goes week by week from April through November, and the people who take it and follow it have, in your experience, good lawns by the following summer and tend to become loyal customers. The ones who do not follow it tend to have problems that require more expensive solutions later, which is also a business model, though you prefer the first one, because the first one builds the relationship that makes the job worth doing beyond the revenue side of it. The woman at the first house on the new development is young, mid-20s, with a toddler on her hip and a yard that is still mostly construction material, and she looks at you with the particular wariness of a woman who's been approached at her door by too many people recently with too many things to sell, and you understand this, and you hand her the seasonal calendar first before you say anything about products, because the calendar is free and it is useful, and it tells her immediately that you are someone who has something to offer before you ask for anything back. She looks at it. She asks about the soil amendment timeline. The question is specific, which means she has been thinking about this, which means she is a serious customer, which means you are going to be here longer than you planned, which is fine. You have nowhere you would rather be. The evening of a Tuesday in May in 1956 finds you back in your own driveway at 6:30, samples in the trunk, order book in the passenger seat, with 18 calls done and 9 sales and 2 follow-up appointments for the fall, and 1 customer you want to come back and check on, not for the business, but because you said you would. You sit in the car for a moment before going in, which is the transition moment between the road and the house, between the person you are in other people's yards and the person you are in your own. Your own yard is decent, not the best on your street, which is a kind of professional joke you tell yourself and occasionally your wife, who does not find it as funny as you do. You know exactly what it needs and exactly what you have not gotten around to doing, and you know that one of the minor occupational hazards of knowing everything about lawns is that your own can sometimes lag behind your clients. because you spend your days attending to theirs and come home with not quite enough left for the one that is actually yours. You will get to it on Saturday. You say this every week. Sometimes it is true. You get out of the car and go inside, and the smell of dinner is in the house, and the evening begins, and outside the yard waits. The same way all the yards are waiting tonight. All 32 on your Tuesday route, and the 17 from Monday and the 24 coming on Wednesday. All of them quietly doing what yards do overnight, which is grow, slowly and without asking, toward whatever they are going to look like by morning. By the time you finish your Tuesday route in a given week, you have been inside 312 feet of other people's fence lines. You have looked at 312 lawns, give or take, and you have talked to perhaps 150 households, and you have learned things about those households, their habits and their resources and their priorities, and their particular relationship to the ground under their feet, that you have never been asked to keep and never been asked to share. But you carry them anyway, the way you carry everything from the road, as a kind of accumulated knowledge about what people are really like when you catch them in their yards on a Tuesday, which is to say, doing the best they can with what they have got, trying to hold up their end of an agreement that nobody wrote down but everybody somehow signed, keeping the place looking like the place is worth keeping, for reasons that are practical and symbolic and deeply, specifically human. There is a version of the 1950s backyard that exists almost entirely in photographs, and it is beautiful, and it is not exactly false. The children are out there in the late afternoon light, barefoot in the grass, running through the spray of a lawn sprinkler. The father is at the barbecue in his weekend shirt, turning something over the coals with the easy confidence of a man presiding over his domain. The mother is coming through the screen door with a tray of something cold to drink, and her hair is done, her skirt is clean, and the garden behind her is in bloom. The yard is green and orderly and full of a happiness that is not performing. It is simply there in the light and the laughter, and the specific pleasure of a summer evening in a place that is yours. This happened. It was real. It deserves to be remembered, because the pleasure was genuine and the life was real, and the people who lived it were real people who felt real things, including the happiness that the photographs captured. Dismissing the 1950s backyard as a manufactured fiction does a disservice to the actual experience of the actual people who grew up in it, or built it, or tended it with genuine care. But there is another version, and it does not appear in the photographs, and it lived in the same yard at the same time, and it deserves equal attention. The unwritten rules of the 1950s neighbourhood were not suggestions. They were a form of community law, enforced not by courts or codes, but by something considerably more immediate and considerably harder to escape: the continuous, attentive, entirely mutual observation of people who lived 40 feet apart and had considerable investment in what their neighbour's yard said about the neighbourhood they had all chosen to live in. The rules about grass height and clothesline placement and fence style and barbecue smoke direction, and the timing of parties and the sound levels of children and the colour of what you painted your shutters were real, and the consequences of violating them were real, and the consequences were not trivial. The primary enforcement mechanism of the 1950s neighbourhood was not the strongly worded letter, though the strongly worded letter existed, and some of them have survived in local archives and make for remarkable reading. The primary enforcement mechanism was social withdrawal. The neighbour who let their lawn go too long, or who hung their laundry in the wrong place, or whose children were too loud at the wrong time, did not receive a fine or a summons. They received a cooling. Conversations that were briefer than they had been. Invitations that did not materialise. The particular unmistakable experience of being in a community and feeling the community's warmth reduced by degrees, without anyone ever saying why. This cooling was effective precisely because it was never explicit. There was nothing to argue with. There was no accusation to deny. There was only the slow, terrible social arithmetic of a neighbourhood signalling that you were failing to hold up your end of something without ever quite naming what the something was. Women experienced this system differently than men, and more acutely, because women spent more of their days visible to their neighbours. A woman who did not have her laundry out by 9 on a Monday morning was noticed. A woman whose kitchen windows were still dark at 8 when everyone else's were lit was noticed. A woman whose children appeared in the yard in torn or dirty clothes was noticed, and the noticing had consequences, because the children's appearance was interpreted as evidence of the mother's competence and care, and the mother's competence and care were, in the social economy of the 1950s neighbourhood, directly connected to the family's standing. The standard that women were being held to was not the standard of the average household. It was the standard of the magazine, which is a considerably more demanding standard, because the magazine showed the kitchen after it had been cleaned, and before it was used again, showed the yard in the golden afternoon light after it had been mowed, and before the children had been through it, showed the woman in the outfit she had changed into because the photographer was coming. The photographs were not lies exactly, but they were edited in ways that made the standard they represented not quite achievable by any real household, which meant that every real household was by some measure falling short. This gap between the standard and the reality was not something that the neighbourhood talked about directly. The neighbourhood talked about it through the clothesline and the lawn and the casserole, through the specific vocabulary of domestic maintenance that allowed enormous amounts of social information to be exchanged without anyone ever saying the actual thing. The woman with the immaculate yard and the fresh curtains and the children always in clean clothes was not being complimented on her lawn or her curtains or her children's clothes. She was being recognised as someone who was holding up her end with exceptional competence, which in the language of this neighbourhood was the highest possible form of praise. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. The woman whose yard was slightly less immaculate was not being criticised for her grass. She was being identified as someone whose household was, in some way that the neighbourhood could not quite articulate, not quite right, and the social cooling that followed was the neighbourhood's way of applying pressure back toward the standard. This pressure was exhausting. That is the part that does not appear in the photographs, the continuous performance of standards that were never quite written down and were therefore never quite achievable, because you could not know with certainty that you had met them, because no one ever said so directly, because the only feedback you got was the continued warmth of your neighbours, which depended on your continued performance, which meant you could never fully relax because relaxing was how the lawn got the clover, and the clothesline got the wrong things on it, and the casserole did not arrive at the right door at the right moment. The exhaustion was real. The women who lived inside the system mostly knew it was real, even if the vocabulary for naming it was not yet available to them. Betty Friedan would publish The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and it would name the unnamed thing, and the response would be enormous and divided and would change American culture permanently. But the book was naming something that had been there all along, something that women had been living with for years before anyone found the words for it, the particular, specific exhaustion of performing a standard of domestic excellence for an audience that was never fully satisfied, in a system that rewarded the performance but never quite acknowledged what the performance cost. The noise rules of the 1950s neighbourhood deserve their own consideration, because noise is perhaps the most immediate and unavoidable way that one household imposes itself on another, and the management of noise in a community of houses built close together with no fences and lots of children, and a culture of outdoor life required a level of shared agreement that went well beyond anything the developers had codified. The general rule, never written but universally understood, was that outdoor life in the backyard was permitted throughout the day on weekdays and Saturdays, with a moderation expected as the evening progressed, and that Sundays occupied their own category. Sunday morning, specifically before noon, was not for mowers or loud music or the kind of party that could be heard 3 houses away. This was partly about church. The neighbourhood assumed that a significant portion of the street would be at services on Sunday morning, and the noise habits of those who were not attending were expected to accommodate those who were. But it was also simply about Sunday as a different kind of day, a day with a different register, a day that asked something of you in terms of quietness that no other day required. The children were the primary noise issue on most streets, and the management of children's noise was one of the more difficult ongoing problems of suburban life in the 1950s, because children are not designed to be quiet and backyards are designed to be used, and the synthesis of those two facts required constant parental negotiation with both the children and the neighbours. The rule about not screaming was essentially unenforceable, because the distinction between the scream of delight and the scream of distress is not one that a child playing in a yard can be expected to maintain on behalf of a neighbour's nap time, and parents who tried to enforce it were often fighting a battle they had already lost before it started. What could be managed was the rule about the fence, which is that you did not put your children up against the fence to yell through it at the neighbour children on the other side. This was a real rule, and it was enforced, and the enforcement was consistent enough that most children on most streets internalised it early, and the yelling through the fence problem diminished over the course of the first summer of a new neighbourhood's life. The children learned the geography of acceptable noise the way they learned everything about the neighbourhood, by testing it and receiving feedback, and by watching what the other children did and calibrating accordingly. The pets were a related but distinct problem. Dogs were common, and dogs were loud, and the management of a dog that barked continuously was one of the defining conflicts of suburban life in the 1950s. A dog that barked for 15 minutes at the mail carrier was socially acceptable. A dog that barked for 2 hours in the afternoon while its owner was at work was not, and the social response to the 2-hour barking dog was as swift and as unmistakable as any other neighbourhood social response, which is to say, it was the cooling, the briefer conversations, the invitations that slowed, and eventually the careful, polite, precisely worded conversation at the door that no one wanted to have, but that the situation eventually required. The management of this conversation, the moment when a neighbour had to tell another neighbour something that needed to be said, was one of the highest stakes social performances in the neighbourhood, because how you delivered criticism and how the recipient received it determined everything about what the relationship was going to look like for the next 10 years, and you were going to be living next to these people for the next 10 years, and the dog was going to be replaced eventually, but the way that conversation went was not going to be replaced, it was going to stay. The etiquette manuals of the 1950s had advice about many things, but were surprisingly cautious about this particular situation, because the etiquette manuals knew, or seemed to sense, that what they were being asked about was not manners but power, and the power dynamics of a neighbourhood complaint were complex enough that no formula was going to cover them adequately. The advice they gave tended toward the gentle and the indirect, suggesting that you raise the matter lightly, perhaps with humour, perhaps framed as a question rather than a complaint, perhaps through the medium of a note rather than a conversation, all of which strategies had their uses but none of which addressed the underlying reality, which was that someone had to say something, and the saying of it was going to be uncomfortable, and the aftermath was going to be whatever it was going to be, and the etiquette manual was not going to be there for that part. The women who navigated these conversations most successfully on streets like yours were the ones who had developed, through experience and observation, a vocabulary for saying the necessary thing in the way that made it most receivable. They had a tone for it, not warm enough to seem oblivious to the awkwardness, and not cold enough to seem punitive. A tone that communicated that this was being raised because the relationship mattered, not because the speaker was looking for a fight, and that the resolution was expected to be friendly, because that was the kind of street this was and the kind of neighbours these were, and anything else would be unfortunate for everyone. This was an art. Like all arts, some people had it and some people did not, and the ones who did not were slightly more likely to find themselves over time in a series of neighbourhood conflicts that never quite resolved, not because the original issues were insoluble, but because the language available to discuss them was not adequate to the task, and the gap between what needed to be said and what could comfortably be said in 1953 to someone you were going to see in the yard every morning for the foreseeable future was sometimes wide enough to make the whole thing collapse into silence and mutual avoidance, which was its own kind of outcome. The garbage situation was less fraught but more consistent as a source of mild neighbourhood friction, because garbage cans in the early 1950s, before the widespread adoption of the plastic bag, were metal and were kept at the side of the house and needed to be moved to the curb on collection day and returned afterward, and the timing and execution of this process was subject to neighbourhood scrutiny in the way that everything in the yard was subject to neighbourhood scrutiny. A can left at the curb for 3 days after collection day was a statement, though not an intentional one. A can that had not been properly secured and whose contents had been distributed by the neighbourhood's dogs was a social event of some magnitude, not because anyone was going to say anything about it directly, but because everyone was going to know, and the knowing was its own form of community accountability that operated without any formal mechanism, but with considerable effectiveness. You have never had a garbage situation. This is something you take a small, private, entirely reasonable pride in. The vegetable garden is where the neighbourhood rules got interesting, because the vegetable garden was somewhere between the lawn's public function and the flower garden's private one. A vegetable garden was practical, which was approved of, and it was productive, which was also approved of, but it was also sometimes not exactly beautiful, which was the complication, because the yard was always making an aesthetic statement whether or not the household thought of it that way, and a vegetable garden in a state of exuberant productivity, which is the only state a serious vegetable garden is ever in during July, does not photograph as cleanly as a lawn. You have made your peace with this. Your vegetable garden is behind the rose of Sharon, which screens it from the walker's kitchen window, and the side that faces the yard is kept reasonably orderly, the stakes straight, and the rows clear, and the abundance of what it produces in July and August is something you've been quietly sharing with the neighbours for 2 years now, which is the correct response to a vegetable garden that produces more than you can use, which is the response that converts a potential aesthetic liability into a social asset, because no one has a complaint about the neighbour with the garden that gives away tomatoes in August. This too is the neighbourhood's rule, not written, not discussed, entirely understood. What is perhaps most striking about the backyard rules of the 1950s, when you look at the full picture, is how much of the work of maintaining them fell on the people who had the least formal power in the neighbourhood hierarchy. The men owned the houses in most cases, the men held the mortgages, the men were the ones whose names appeared on the legal documents and whose credit ratings determined whether the family could stay. And yet the men were away from the neighbourhood for 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, in offices and factories and shops, which meant that the neighbourhood, during those hours, was maintained almost entirely by the women who were in it. The daytime neighbourhood was a female world. The women who stayed home, and in the early 1950s that were still the majority of married women in these communities, were the ones who saw what happened during the day, who noticed the changes in a neighbour's situation, who tracked the rhythms of the street, who managed the social infrastructure that made the neighbourhood function as a community, rather than simply as a collection of houses. The man who came home at 6 and mowed his lawn on Saturday and attended the neighbourhood association meeting once a quarter was participating in the neighbourhood, genuinely. But the woman who was in it every day, who ran its daily social life, who maintained its relationships and its standards and its systems of support and its systems of pressure, she was not merely participating, she was the neighbourhood in the most literal and daily sense. This labour was not compensated. It was not acknowledged, not formally, not in any way that translated into economic or social recognition. It was expected, the way all labour that is both essential and invisible is expected, which is to say it was absorbed into the category of just what you do, which is the category that contains a great deal of what keeps the world functioning. The woman who brought the casserole when the baby arrived was doing something real and important for the community, something that no institution was providing and that someone had to provide. The woman who tracked the neighbour's deteriorating situation and organised the quiet network of support before anyone formally acknowledged that support was needed was doing something that no official system could have done with the same effectiveness. The woman who managed the neighbourhood's relationship with its own standards, who enforced through social means what could not be enforced through law, was performing a genuine community function. None of this appeared in the deed restrictions. None of it appeared in the etiquette manuals. It was the invisible infrastructure of the post-war American neighbourhood, maintained by the labour of women who were expected to provide it, and who generally did provide it, and who were, in the course of providing it, also constrained by it, because the same expectation of domestic performance that gave them their community role also limited their freedom to step outside it. The women who did step outside it, who went back to work in the mid-1950s, or who pursued interests that were not domestic, or who simply declined to participate in certain of the community's social rituals, encountered the social pressure in its sharpest form, because the pressure was not just about lawn height and clothesline placement. It was about participation in the community's self-maintenance project, and the woman who opted out of parts of that project was, in the logic of the neighbourhood, opting out of the community itself, which was the most serious social risk available in a world where the community was also your daily social environment, and your support network, and the context in which your children were growing up. This is what made the conformity so effective and so difficult to resist. It was not enforced by anything external. It was enforced by the thing that was most valuable and most necessary, belonging to the community, being part of it, having it available to you in the moments when you needed it. The cost of nonconformity was not a fine or a lawsuit. It was the slow withdrawal of the thing that made living in a place like this bearable, which was the warmth and the mutual support and the daily social world of women who were doing similar things under similar conditions and who understood each other's lives in the specific and concrete way that only people in the same situation understand each other. That understanding was real. The warmth was real. The casserole that arrived when you had the baby was real, and it was warm, and it was made by someone who knew exactly what you needed, because she had been there herself, and she was making it not because a system required it, but because the community was the system, and she was the community, and the casserole was the language in which that fact was expressed. This is the full picture. The rules and the warmth were not separate things. They were the same thing, seen from two angles, which is what community always is. The obligation and the belonging, inseparable. The weight and the comfort of living not alone but together, on the same street, under the same morning sky, with the same clover in the south corner, and the same rows of Sharon going up the same fence and the same long Saturday still ahead. The exhaustion was not the only cost. The neighbourhood rules of the 1950s also carried a second cost that was less personal and more structural, and considerably less often discussed. The rules were not applied equally to everyone, because everyone was not allowed in. The deed restrictions that Levitt and hundreds of other developers wrote into their communities were not peripheral elements of the post-war suburban project. They were central to its economic logic, because the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, which guaranteed the mortgages that made suburban home ownership possible for millions of Americans, had its own manual for evaluating neighbourhoods, a document called the Underwriting Manual, which instructed appraisers to evaluate the racial and ethnic composition of a neighbourhood when determining its value. A neighbourhood that was, in the FHA's terminology, infiltrated by inharmonious racial groups was considered a credit risk, and the mortgages in that neighbourhood were either not guaranteed or guaranteed at worse terms. What this meant in practice was that the lawn care and the casserole and the clothesline protocols and all of the elaborate social machinery of the post-war suburban neighbourhood were built on a foundation that explicitly excluded black Americans, and to a lesser degree other non-white families, from participating in the system at all. The rules that governed the yards were available only to the people who were allowed to own yards in that neighbourhood, and the people who were allowed to own yards in that neighbourhood were, by design, overwhelmingly and by legal covenant, white. The GI Bill that sent millions of veterans to college and helped millions more buy homes was available in principle to all veterans. In practice, the Veterans Administration and the FHA's linked mortgage guarantee system directed almost all of its benefits toward white families. Black veterans were, in most of the country's new suburban developments, simply not permitted to buy homes. The wealth-building mechanism that transformed the American working and middle class in the post-war decades, the mechanism that made it possible for a family to own something, to accumulate equity, to pass something on to their children, was not made available equally. The backyard and everything it represented, the safety, the status, the quiet daily confirmation that you had made it, was not equally available. This was not incidental to the post-war suburban project. It was structural to it. The women who did not get the note about the clothesline because they were not permitted to live on the street the clothesline was on. The men who did not get to argue about the diagonal mowing because they were not permitted to own the lawn that was being discussed. The children who did not get to play in the sprinkler in the golden afternoon light because the neighbourhood's deed restrictions explicitly and legally prohibited their families from living there. These are the people in the photograph that the photograph did not take. The racial covenants were declared unenforceable by the Supreme Court in 1948 in a case called Shelley versus Kramer, but declaring them unenforceable did not make the neighbourhoods they had created accessible. The suburbs that had been built with FHA money under FHA guidelines, the Levitt towns and the park forests and the hundreds of developments built on their model, remained racially homogeneous well into the 1960s, not because a law required it after 1948, but because the pattern had been set and the economics of the system continued to operate in the same direction, even without the legal mechanism, because banks were still reluctant to lend, and real estate agents were still steering, and neighbours were still expressing their preferences through the same social pressure that they applied to lawn maintenance. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 formally prohibited racial discrimination in housing. It was passed 4 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., in a Congress that had resisted similar legislation for years, and its passage represented an enormous shift in the legal landscape, even if the practical landscape shifted more slowly, as practical landscapes always do. The history of who was allowed into the 1950s backyard and who was not is not a comfortable history, and it does not fit neatly into the photograph of the summer evening, with the children and the sprinkler and the father at the grill. But it is the same history. It lives in the same yard. The beauty of what was there and the injustice of who was excluded are not separate stories that happen to take place in the same setting. They are the same story, told from different positions, and both versions have to be part of the account if the account is going to be honest. There are other costs in the photograph that did not get taken. There is the cost of the conformity itself, the rules that told you what colour to paint the shutters and how high to let the grass grow and where to put the clothesline, rules that were not about safety or public health or any objective standard of community well-being, but were about the performance of a specific version of American domestic life that was, in 1953, still in the process of defining itself. The post-war suburb was a new thing. It had not existed before in quite this form. The people who moved into it were not inheriting a set of customs that had developed over generations. They were making them up, or absorbing them from magazines and advertisements and the behaviour of their neighbours, which was the behaviour of other people who were also making it up. The rules about how to be a neighbour in a Levitt house were being invented in real time, by people who had grown up in apartments or farmhouses or urban neighbourhoods with entirely different customs, and the invention process was not always comfortable. The pressure to conform in the early years of these communities was partly practical. When everyone is new, when no one has a history in the place, the most available method for establishing community is the shared standard, the visible and legible commitment to a certain kind of maintenance that says we are all in this together and we are all trying. That pressure had a genuine social function. It built the community, or helped to build it, by giving people something to agree on before they had the shared history that communities normally run on. But the pressure also had a cost, which is the cost of any system of mandatory performance. People who needed to be different, who had different resources or different aesthetics or different ideas about what the yard was for, experienced the pressure as exclusion rather than community. People who could not meet the standard because of illness or poverty, or the simple arithmetic of a week that had too much in it for the lawn to get the attention it needed, experienced the neighbourhood's response as punishment for circumstances that were not always within their control. The barbecue itself, that central symbol of the 1950s backyard, the cast iron kettle or the rectangular hibachi or eventually the gleaming gas model with the side burners, was a complicated object in the social geography of the neighbourhood. It was male territory, in a way that the kitchen was female territory, and the grilling of meat on a Saturday afternoon was a performance of masculine domestic competence that carried its own rules, its own equipment hierarchy, its own vocabulary of technique and opinion that men deployed with an earnestness that was, in retrospect, touching and a little absurd. But the barbecue was also a social event, and social events have guest lists, and guest lists are where the neighbourhood showed its seams. Who was invited, who was not, how the invitations went out and through what channels, what it meant to be included and what it meant to be left out. These were not trivial questions in a community where your social standing was tied so directly to your visibility in the collective outdoor life of the street. The barbecue was the yard's most legible social event, and the politics of the barbecue were the politics of the neighbourhood, played out over charcoal and hamburger and the particular cheerful performance of casual summer leisure. The fences themselves told a story, or rather their absence told it. Levitt's original Levitt towns did not include backyard fences, and many of the early developments discouraged them, because fences interrupted the visual flow of the connected green space that was one of the development's aesthetic selling points, and because fences signalled a level of private withdrawal from the neighbourhood that ran against the social grain of what these communities were supposed to be. The open backyard, visible from the surrounding yards, was a design choice with social consequences, because the open yard meant the visible yard, and the visible yard meant the observed life. The fences came in over time as the communities matured and the original ideology of openness gave way to the practical desire for privacy that most people, given the option, tend to prefer. By the early 1960s, fences were appearing on streets that had been designed to be open, and the neighbourhood conversations about fences about who had put one up and whether it was the right height, and whether the chosen style was acceptable, were the same conversation as every other neighbourhood conversation. The negotiation between the individual and the community about what the community had the right to ask of its members and what the members had the right to keep for themselves. The 1950s backyard rules were, in the final accounting, a document of a particular moment in American social history, a moment when a new kind of community was being created from scratch and was working out, in real time, through the daily negotiations of lawn and fence and clothesline and casserole, what it owed itself and what it owed its members and how those two things were supposed to coexist. The answers it came up with were imperfect. They were also human and recognisable, and the questions they were trying to answer are the same questions that any community in any time has to work out somehow. The yard was never just the yard. It was the community thinking out loud about what it was and what it wanted to be, and the conversation it was having was not only about grass height and clothesline placement, though it was also, very specifically and in detail, about those things. It was about what kind of place this was going to be, and who was going to be in it, and what would be expected of everyone, and what would happen if someone fell short. These are questions that every community asks. The answers matter. The lawn was just where this particular community chose to ask them. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Oh, and if you'd rather just listen, we're on Spotify too, link in the description. Tonight we have come a long way across one small piece of American ground. We started in a backyard on a summer Saturday in 1953, in a house dress and an apron with flour on the counter and laundry in the basket and the whole long day ahead. We stayed with William Levitt, a man who looked at a potato field on Long Island and saw a neighbourhood that had not yet happened, and then made it happen at a speed and scale that nobody had imagined possible, and in doing so gave millions of Americans their first piece of outdoor ground to call their own, while simultaneously building into the architecture of that gift a set of restrictions and expectations that we are still, in various ways, living with. We rode the routes with Ray, our salesman with his sample case and his seasonal calendar, and his 12 minutes in every yard on every street, a man who understood something true and specific about American domestic life, because he had been inside it, lawn by lawn, season by season, long enough to read what it was actually saying, and we looked at what the backyard rules were actually enforcing, which was more than grass height and more than clothesline placement, and which carried inside it both the genuine warmth of a community trying to hold itself together and the very real injustice of a system that was not building that community for everyone. What connects all of these, if you sit with them long enough, is something simpler than any of the history or the rules or the social machinery. People making do, people taking the specific materials of their specific moment, whatever those materials are, and trying to build something with them that feels like home. The woman with the laundry basket in the morning light was doing this. The woman who could not buy a house on that street was doing this somewhere else, with different materials and greater difficulty. William Levitt was doing this, with ambition, and not a little ruthlessness, and a genuinely transformative result. Ray the salesman was doing this, making a livelihood from the desire of people to maintain something that mattered to them, which is not a trivial thing to make a livelihood from. The backyard of the 1950s was a real place. It smelled like cut grass and charcoal and the particular early summer sweetness of climbing roses going up a fence, and it was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The warmth of a space that people had invested in and cared about and tended with genuine attention over time. The things that were wrong with it were also real. Both of those truths live in the same yard, and the yard can hold them, because a yard, like a good history, is big enough to hold the whole story if you are willing to look at all of it. The clothesline is empty now. The tomatoes are staked and the rose bushes watered, and the casserole is at the neighbour's door and the children are in for the night. The fireflies are coming up from the grass. The street is quiet. Somewhere on a Tuesday route, Ray is in his driveway looking at his own lawn and thinking about Saturday. Somewhere in a Long Island farm field turned suburb, a family is sitting on their back step in the evening air and feeling, quietly and specifically, that they made the right choice, that this is theirs, that the ground under their feet is actually theirs, and that feeling is not nothing. That feeling is real, and it costs something, and it was built by somebody, and it deserved to be felt. You can rest now. The yard is in order. The day is behind you. The grass will still be there in the morning, growing the way grass does, toward whatever is coming next, patient and unhurried and green. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.